Multiple contacts, inbound trajectory confirmed, Lieutenant Valen called out, his voice steady despite the storm of red markers multiplying across the laser plasma display. Inside Proxima 3's primary command center, the room crackled with tension. Static-laced transmissions poured in, confirming what they already knew. The Orvax fleet had arrived. Administrator Callan Vorst stood rigid at the center console, staring at the incoming warships with the cold realization that no help was coming. 75,000 settlers, and the only thing between them and annihilation was a distress signal that had been fired off hours ago. "Transmit the Council priority message again," Forrest ordered, his knuckles whitening against the edge of the control panel. "Make it clear, if they don't intervene, this planet will be wiped from existence." Valen relayed the command, but deep down, Vorst knew the truth. The Galactic Council didn't care. Across the galaxy, in the grand chamber of the Galactic Confederation on Tarsus Prime, Earth's ambassador Lucian Ormont stood before a semicircle of alien representatives. The chamber, a sprawling amphitheater of tiered seating beneath a massive, suspended projection of Proxima 3, was eerily quiet as his words echoed through the hall. "The Orvax marauders will be in orbital range within the hour. Proxima 3 is a registered colony of the Confederation," Ormont said, his voice clipped and precise. "Under the Fifth Security Doctrine, that means—" Minister Arox Vedris, seated at the highest tier, waved a crystalline hand, cutting him off mid-sentence. "Proxima 3 is a Category F colony," Vedris said, his tone almost bored. "The Confederation does not commit defense assets to non-strategic territories." Ormont didn't flinch. "There are 75,000 civilians on that planet." Minister Uvex Kor, a reptilian bureaucrat with dull orange scales, leaned forward, steepling his clawed fingers. "Deploying a battle group requires time, Ambassador. The nearest fleet is 9 days away." He exhaled, feigning sympathy. "Even if we wanted to help, we simply cannot." Ormont's gaze swept the chamber. There were no outbursts of outrage, no rising voices of protest. Only silence. A silence that told him this decision had already been made long before he arrived. Across the room, strategist Relthak Jor, an amphibious species known for their tactical foresight, studied Ormont with narrowed pupils. The human wasn't pleading. He wasn't bargaining. He was waiting. And that unsettled him. On Proxima 3, the exodus was already underway. There were no alarms, no panicked broadcasts, just quiet orders given and followed. A convoy of freighters, posing as routine cargo shipments, slipped away under false export logs, bypassing orbital scans with coded clearance authorizations. Families packed light. A child clutched a worn-out spacesuit patch, the only thing he could bring from the home he was about to leave behind forever. Beneath the colony's surface, Director Hal Vexen watched as engineers completed the final adjustments to the biosignature fabrication arrays. The system was complex. Heat emissions, synthetic vital readings, atmospheric fluctuations, all mimicking a fully populated settlement. A young technician hesitated before finalizing the sequence. "If the Orvax scan for survivors, they'll see exactly what they expect to see," Vexen replied. Above ground, Major Elias Creon led his team in erasing every trace of human technology the Confederation could reverse engineer. Encrypted servers were incinerated with thermite charges. Prototype fabrication units were smashed to pieces. By the time the last civilian freighter burned through the upper atmosphere, there was nothing left on Proxima 3 but ghosts. 2 hours later, the Galactic Council issued its official response. A single text transmission, motion denied. Inside a hidden command station nestled in the gravitational distortions of a dead star system, Admiral Jericho Dane read the words without emotion. He had expected this. Without looking away from the display, he issued the order that had been prepared for years. Activate Protocol Red Horizon. Across the Confederation, the vanishing began. A deep space refinery technician scheduled for routine maintenance never arrived for his shift. An entire medical supply convoy failed to make its scheduled drop-off. A ship captain docking at a human-operated fueling station found the platform eerily abandoned. His request for clearance met with silence. By the time the first panicked diplomats realized something was wrong, half of the Confederation's logistical infrastructure had begun to collapse. Trade convoys stalled, spaceport hubs ground to a halt, human labor, engineers, logistics coordinators, every single one of them was gone. On Proxima 3, the Orvax fleet arrived. Overlord Sargath Vel leaned back in his command chair, his rows of sharp teeth twisting into a grin. The planetary scan confirmed what he had hoped for. Tens of thousands of human life signatures, heat readings, movement patterns, even distress signals. "Didn't I tell you?" Vel chuckled, gesturing at the holographic readout. The Confederation left them to rot. This will be effortless. The first wave of bombardments rained down, leveling city centers, supply depots, and communication hubs. They expected screaming. They expected emergency transmissions. Instead, there was nothing. Vel's grin faltered. "Ground teams deploy!" Dropships pierced through the stratosphere, dispersing Orvax raiding squads across urban centers. Streets lay eerily empty, buildings intact, but lifeless. Then came the first report. No bodies, no resistance. Then another. All structures abandoned, no physical evidence of casualties. Then the final blow. "Commander, it's a trap." The bridge of Vel's flagship fell silent. And then the system-wide warning sirens ignited in full force. At the outer edge of the sector, a faint distortion shimmered against the darkness of space. At first it was almost imperceptible, a flicker of energy, a ghost on the sensors. Then it took form. Dozens. No, hundreds of warships materialized from beyond standard scan range. Not Confederation vessels, not allies. The Phalanx fleet. The bridge descended into chaos. Tactical officers scrambled to decode transponder signals, assess threat levels, anything. But no matter what analysis they ran, the results all came back to the same unshakable conclusion. Humanity had never been weak. "Sir," a comms officer stammered, "they're transmitting." Vel's claws dug into the armrests of his chair as a single transmission came through the bridge speakers. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't a demand. It was a statement of fact. "Engage at will." The first human warship fired. In the next breath, hell followed. Flashes of silent destruction reflected off the cold visor of Commander Ren Varos as he watched the tactical overlay on his heads-up display. Across Confederation space, systems were unraveling in orchestrated silence. One warp gate offline, another. A supply convoy lost in a star's gravity well, its navigation mysteriously corrupted. Power grids flickered, plunging entire districts into darkness, while control towers scrambled for solutions that would never come. It had begun. The station above Vorlis Prime, a bustling trade hub just days ago, had transformed into a dead shell, drifting without guidance. Docked freighters hung in place, their mooring clamps locked without release commands. Automated service drones sat frozen, their programming wiped clean. Frantic station operators tried to override security protocols, only to be met with rejection loops. It was not sabotage in the traditional sense. It was abandonment. Varos tilted his head slightly, catching the reflection of the stars against the reinforced viewport. He keyed his communicator. "All non-essential human personnel have cleared out. Phase 2 is underway." A clipped acknowledgement followed before the line went dead. There was nothing left to say. Across Confederation-controlled space, the realization crept in like a slow-moving toxin. Where were the humans? Inside the grand halls of Tarsus Prime, the murmurs among ministers grew restless. The first reports had been dismissed. Minor logistical disruptions, nothing beyond standard variance. Then the failures multiplied. Minister Uvek's core paced before the grand projection of the core systems, his frilled crest twitching with unease. "This can't be coincidental," he muttered, glancing toward the cluster of reports accumulating on the data slab in his hand. Communications blackouts, abandoned checkpoints, a medical supply chain halted mid-transit. Across the chamber, Minister Arax Vedris leaned back in his seat, crystalline ridges catching the dim overhead lighting. "A temporary disturbance," he dismissed. "Humans are known for their unpredictability." Core wasn't convinced. He turned to the security analyst beside him. "Confirm human labor force distribution across Confederation holdings." The analyst hesitated before responding. 38% in direct operations, an additional 11% in subcontracted logistics. Core stopped pacing. Half. He exhaled sharply. "And how many of them remain?" The analyst's fingers trembled against the interface. 2%. The silence that followed was absolute. Vedris straightened, his earlier amusement evaporating. That's not a coincidence. Core felt a slow dread creep into his bones. He turned toward the planetary defense liaison, his voice strained. "Order a full audit. Now." It was already too late. On Kelvos Prime, a team of Confederation engineers pried open the doors to what was once a bustling human-operated refueling station. Inside, they found only empty corridors, displays flashing system error messages. The command consoles had been wiped clean, all security measures disabled, but not a single system remained operational. The power grid had been severed at its core. The Kelvos station overwatch officer stepped forward, his claws clicking against the polished flooring as he surveyed the deserted workspace. A single message had been left behind, displayed on the main interface in bright crimson lettering. "No service available." The officer swallowed. For the first time in his life, he understood what it felt like to be on the losing side of a game he never knew was being played. While the Council struggled to comprehend the void that humanity had left behind, Major Elias Creon moved through the corridors of a classified research facility on Bellis 4, overseeing the final retrieval of sensitive human technology. The facility had once been a joint venture, a shining example of human cooperation within the Confederation's scientific divisions. Now the workstations lay dismantled, project cores gutted and extracted. Creon's team worked swiftly, pulling every last ounce of data, every prototype, every secured archive before sealing the research nodes with charges. One of his operatives paused, glancing at the abandoned prototype gravimetric stabilizers still mounted along the research bay walls. "Should we disable them?" Creon studied the devices before shaking his head. "Number, let them try to figure it out. By the time they realize what's missing, it won't matter." He left the room as the controlled detonations erased what little remained. The first cracks in the Confederation's power structure had begun to show. On Tarsus Prime, strategist Relthak Jor watched from the periphery of the council chamber as the ministers spiraled into chaos. He had known something was coming. He had seen the signs, the way humans had embedded themselves quietly into key infrastructure, the way they had learned without revealing everything they knew. But he had underestimated the scope. A message flashed across the central council display. "Proxima 3 under attack, Orvax fleet in orbit." Minister Vedris lifted his head, an unreadable expression crossing his crystalline face. "Dispatch the defense fleet." Silence. The military coordinator hesitated. "There is no available fleet within immediate range, Minister." Vedris blinked once, twice. Then his gaze swept toward Core. "The humans knew." Core's breath was slow, deliberate. They knew. In the depths of Proxima 3's orbit, the Orvax fleet loomed over what they believed to be a crippled colony. Sargeth Vel reclined in his command throne, eyes flicking over the readings. The distress signals pulsed, the heat emissions fluctuated. The biosignatures of thousands filled the planetary grid. It was everything he expected. And yet, something was wrong. His second-in-command shifted uneasily. "We've seen no planetary response, Overlord." Vel exhaled through his sharpened teeth. "Then they are broken. We take what we want." The order was given. Orvax forces descended upon Proxima 3, deploying squads in formation across major urban centers. Heavy boots struck against dust-coated pavement as armored warriors pushed through abandoned streets, their weapons raised for combat that never came. A forward scout entered what should have been a command hub, his targeting visor flickering as it adjusted to the dim interior. He approached a console, expecting resistance. Instead, he found a flickering display. Projected population, 75,000. Actual population, 0. His exhale was sharp. Then the planetary alarms triggered. From orbit, Vel saw it happen in real time. The fabricated biosignatures flickered, then vanished. The thermal emissions flatlined, the distress signals cut off, and then the planetary defense grid activated. The trap had closed. At that exact moment, hundreds of human warships emerged from beyond standard scan range. Phalanx fleet had arrived. In the depths of the council chamber, strategist Relthak Jor turned away from the unfolding disaster and muttered what no one else dared to voice. This was never about Proxima. "Commence planetary descent," Sargath Vel ordered, his black-scaled fingers tapping against the command interface as the first wave of dropships broke through the thin upper atmosphere of Proxima 3. His golden eyes gleamed as the displays filled with streams of data, human distress signals pulsing weakly, bio readings scattered across the surface like helpless prey awaiting the slaughter. The warriors of the Orvax Dominion sat strapped into their assault carriers, their armor rattling as the shock absorbers absorbed atmospheric turbulence. The descent was smooth, too smooth. Vel relished the ease of the conquest. There were no anti-aircraft defenses, no scrambled fighter squadrons, nothing, just a colony lying helpless beneath them. He keyed into the open council broadcast frequency, his voice slipping into the public channel reserved for diplomatic affairs. "To the leaders of the Confederation," he began, letting each syllable carry the weight of mockery. "The humans you so callously abandoned are no more. Proxima 3 belongs to the Orvax Dominion. You may thank us for handling what you would not." He leaned back, satisfied. There was no immediate response. Below, the dropships glided between half-standing buildings, the shattered cityscape bathed in the glow of scattered fires. A few automated lights flickered on some structures, remnants of what once had been an active colony. Vel's warriors disembarked, spreading into spearhead formations down barren streets. Yet something gnawed at him. The reports should have been coming in, signs of captured survivors, resistance pockets, holdouts desperately clinging to life. Instead, silence. The first patrol moved into a hollowed-out command center, a place that should have been filled with scrambling defenders. The lead soldier scanned the laser plasma displays, watching as human biosignatures blinked on and off like ghosts. "Commander, something isn't right." Vel exhaled sharply, his tail coiling against the metal flooring of his flagship's bridge. "You're wasting time. Secure the primary structures and report back." Then the lights cut out. In every Orvax dropship, in every occupied sector, the biosignatures vanished. Not one by one, all at once. It was the last warning they would get. From beneath the streets, the planet woke up, buried deep beneath Proxima 3's surface, pulse batteries ignited with blinding fury. Targeting systems locked onto exposed Orvax warships, and in the space of a single heartbeat, the first wave of landing craft disintegrated under blistering fire. Shockwaves ripped through the invading forces. Ground troops caught in open zones watched in horror as defensive turrets unfolded from concealed platforms along rooftops, their rotating barrels spraying tungsten rounds into the unprepared formations. "Ambush! We are under attack!" The Orvax command net erupted in a frenzy of panicked voices. Vel bolted upright, his eyes scanning the data flooding his ship's command interface. The distress signals had been a mirage, the biosignatures fabricated. Proxima 3 had been empty the whole time. The Orvax had not invaded a colony. They had walked straight into a kill box. Vel snarled, slamming his clawed fist into the communications panel. "Recall all ground forces. Pull them out now." No response. Only static. Above the planet, the Orvax fleet detected an anomaly, an impossible surge of energy signatures. Beyond Proxima 3's gravitational field, something shifted. A distortion at the system's edge rippled through the long-range scanners, warping the readings into unreadable chaos. Then, in the space of mere seconds, the distortion solidified into unmistakable forms. Phalanx fleet had arrived. Vel froze, his mind scrambling to process what he was seeing. Hundreds, no thousands, of warships materialized from beyond standard scan range, emerging like a predator uncoiling from the abyss. Their hulls bore no Confederation insignias, no markings of negotiation or peace. only the cold, unfeeling black of a species that had spent decades observing, waiting, preparing. The comms channel crackled to life, and a voice cut through the static, calm and absolute. All vessels, engage at will. The first strike hit before the Orvax could even think to react. From the human battleships, hypersonic kinetic rounds tore through enemy hulls like brittle glass. Railguns spat ferrous slugs at relativistic speeds, turning shielded command ships into burning debris. Orvax warships attempted evasive maneuvers, their thrusters flaring in desperation. It did not matter. Human targeting systems calculated every trajectory before they even moved. From the outer flanks of the formation, directed plasma arrays lanced through the void, burning through shield generators with heat so intense that entire decks melted before alarms could sound. In the span of 12 minutes, the battlefield was no longer a battlefield. It was a graveyard. On the Tarsus Prime Council floor, high-ranking officials watched in mute horror as the broadcast feed from the Orvax fleet flickered and cut into static one by one. Minister Arox Vedris, for the first time in his career, was at a loss for words. Strategist Relthak Jor barely blinked as he muttered almost to himself, "They never wanted our help. They wanted proof." The last remaining Orvax flagship, its hull half-slagged and venting atmosphere, tried to flee. A human dreadnought moved into its path, its forward batteries cycling for one final shot. A single transmission was sent from Admiral Jericho Dane's command ship to the doomed vessel. No survivors. The Orvax flagship vanished in a fireball so bright it briefly eclipsed the nearest star. Then the battlefield fell silent. On Tarsus Prime, a hush settled over the council chamber. The confident smirks, the bureaucratic dismissals, the carefully measured indifference. Gone. Minister Uvex Kor swallowed, his throat dry. "We should open negotiations." Vedris didn't respond. Across the chamber, strategist Jor exhaled slowly, his eyes never leaving the flickering remnants of the battle feed. "You still think this was about Proxima?" he murmured. The wreckage of the Orvax fleet drifted in chaotic spirals, shattered hulls tumbling through the void in eerie silence. Plasma fires flickered where atmosphere still clung to fractured bulkheads, their light casting unnatural shadows across the twisted remnants of once mighty warships. Not a single human vessel bore damage. The battle had been over before it had truly begun. Inside the command deck of the Terran flagship Indomitus, Admiral Jericho Dane stood motionless, watching the debris field through the reinforced viewport. Below, Proxima 3 lay undisturbed, the barren world untouched by what should have been its destruction. A comms officer turned, his voice firm. "The Council has been monitoring the battle. We intercepted a priority transmission between Minister Vedris and Kor. They're scrambling." Dane's expression didn't change. "Send the message." The transmission pulsed across the Confederation's priority channels, overriding lower-tier communications. It reached every council seat, every defense director, every trade official, all at once. His voice carried no anger, no triumph, just the cold edge of inevitability. "Your inaction was expected, your failure was inevitable, your authority is over." On Tarsus Prime, the council chamber fell into a stunned silence. The laser plasma displays hovering above the circular assembly flickered, shifting to display the obliterated Orvax fleet in real time. Fractured warships still spun lifelessly in the void, some collapsing inward as their structural integrity failed. Minister Arox Vedris leaned forward, crystalline fingers gripping the edge of his podium as if grounding himself in reality. His expression, once so carefully unreadable, betrayed the first hints of something unfamiliar, unease. Across from him, Minister Uvex Kor exhaled through tight jaws. His gaze flicked to the silent figures of his fellow representatives. None of them met his eyes. He murmured, almost to himself, "This was never about Proxima, was it?" Strategist Relthak Jor, the only one who had truly considered the possibility of this moment, did not move. His mind was already processing what came next. The Council's emergency session convened in haste. The chamber, usually governed by strict procedure, was a whirlwind of frenzied deliberation. The representatives of dozens of species spoke over one another, voices laced with varying degrees of disbelief, anger, and barely concealed fear. They dismantled an entire Orvax war fleet in minutes. We have no countermeasure against them. They hold no official military presence within Confederation-controlled space. This violates... Violates? Kor's voice cut through the noise like a blade. He rose to his full height, his reptilian gaze sweeping the room. You speak of violations? Where was this concern when we left 75,000 of their people to die? The chamber stilled. A new transmission overrode the comms. The laser plasma displays above the council podiums flickered, shifting to a live feed from the entry corridor. A man in a stark black officer's uniform strode forward, flanked by two silent figures in the same midnight-colored attire. No guards attempted to stop them. The delegates in the chamber knew why. Admiral Jericho Dane had arrived. A calculated pause stretched as he stepped onto the central floor of the chamber, taking in the gathered officials with measured scrutiny. He carried himself without tension, his hands relaxed behind his back, his stare unwavering. The weight in the room was suffocating. Vedris was the first to find his voice. "Admiral Dane," he started, the formal tone barely masking his uncertainty. "We understand tensions are high, but surely—" Dane's gaze snapped to him. "You misunderstand, Minister. This is not a negotiation." Vedris closed his mouth. Dain took another step forward, addressing the chamber without raising his voice, but commanding all attention nonetheless. Humanity has spent decades under the illusion of cooperation. We have obeyed your laws, upheld your treaties, and followed your directives, all while being treated as expendable. We were tolerated so long as we remained useful. That era is over. Kor shifted in his seat, his throat tightening. "What exactly are you demanding?" Dain tilted his head slightly, as if amused by the question. "The following terms are non-negotiable." A silent signal was given, and every laser plasma display in the chamber shifted again, this time revealing a map of Confederation space. Red markers blinked across every major trade hub, key defense station, and industrial world. Dane continued, his voice even. "Effective immediately, all human colonies are recognized as sovereign territories. Any Confederation interference will be considered an act of war." The chamber bristled, murmurs rippling through the ranks. Dane ignored them. "Earth's representation in the Council will be proportional to our economic and military contribution. By all objective measures, that makes us the single largest governing body within this assembly." Vedris stiffened. "You are restructuring the entire Confederation's hierarchy." Dane barely blinked. "Correct." Kor exhaled sharply. "And if we refuse?" Dane looked at him directly, as if assessing his intelligence. "Then humanity will withdraw completely." His voice was like steel wrapped in finality. "No military alliances. No shared technology. No trade. You will lose 38% of your logistical infrastructure overnight. Your transit lanes will fracture. Your fleets will run dry. Your food shipments will stall." Silence. Vedris inhaled slowly, realizing the scale of what they faced. "You are saying," the crystalline minister murmured, his voice carefully controlled, "that the Confederation cannot survive without humanity." Dane's expression did not change. "I am not saying it. I am stating fact." No one spoke. Strategist Jor leaned back, exhaling softly through his ridged gills. His gaze flicked to the red markers covering the map, the silent human warships waiting in unseen positions. It was not a threat. It was an unspoken reality. The Confederation had a choice: accept the new power balance, or collapse. The chamber remained frozen for 5 long seconds. Then Vedris straightened, his crystalline features unreadable. "A vote will be held." Dane's lips barely curved at the edges. "Take all the time you need." Without another word, he turned, exiting the chamber with the same measured pace he had entered. Behind him, the council floor erupted into frantic deliberation. Jor remained seated, watching the displays flicker as the weight of the new order settled into reality. Earth had not declared war. It had not launched an invasion. It had simply removed its cooperation. And the Confederation had crumbled beneath its absence. The chamber was silent. Not the tense kind of silence that preceded a difficult decision, but the absolute void that followed irreversible realization. Above the council floor, the laser plasma displays flickered, their projections shifting into a final, undeniable truth. Thousands of unseen red markers appeared across the Confederation's stellar map. Human stealth ships, hidden, watching, present long before today. Minister Arax Vedris had no words left. His crystalline fingers curled slightly, his breath measured but unsteady. The realization sank into him like a weight he could not lift. Across the chamber, Uvek's core exhaled through clenched jaws, his frilled crest lying flat against his scaled head. He no longer sought control. It had never been theirs to begin with. The vote was cast, but it was irrelevant. Some nodded solemnly, accepting the inevitable. Others refused to raise their hands at all, not in defiance, but in the paralyzing recognition that their resistance would change nothing. The Confederation had not lost a war today. It had simply been made aware of one it had already lost long ago. Admiral Jericho Dane stood at the center of it all, his presence still, unwavering. He did not look triumphant nor vengeful. He did not need to be. Minister Tholen, a being who had spent a lifetime orchestrating diplomatic intricacies, whispered, as though speaking it too loudly would make it real. "You were always ahead of us. We were never in control, were we?" Dane's gaze settled on him. No. He let the weight of that simple answer sink in before he spoke again. Earth never needed the Confederation. The Confederation always needed Earth. A measured pause. Then he turned. "This meeting is adjourned." Without waiting for a reply, he walked away, his officers following in his wake. No one tried to stop them. Across the galaxy, the ripples of this moment expanded outward. On the colony world of Kelvos 4, where human engineers had once been contracted to oversee industrial expansions, Confederation contractors arrived to empty stations and non-functional assembly lines. The mechanisms were still there, but something was missing. The designs were human. The configurations were human. The problem-solving techniques, the redundancies, the fail-safes. All of it belonged to a species that no longer answered their calls. Elsewhere, in the trade hub of Sarek's Drift, a delegation of Safri diplomats, a species once wary of human unpredictability, waited for their first-ever self-initiated diplomatic meeting with Earth. One of them adjusted their ceremonial robes, glancing at their counterpart with measured apprehension. "Do you think they will accept our proposal?" The other diplomat, a senior in their field, replied with something bordering on bitter amusement. "We no longer dictate the terms." In the Terran capital, the command center aboard the Indomitus was dimly lit, save for the soft glow of active displays. Kate Summers stood before the tactical map, her arms crossed, her gaze distant. The war had never been about battles or victories. It had been about establishing order where none had existed before. Major Elias Creon approached, his stance relaxed, but his tone thoughtful. "You've been quiet." She didn't answer at first. Instead, she tapped the console, shifting the strategic overview. "The Confederation will adapt," she said finally. "They'll tell themselves this was inevitable, that they never stood a chance." Creon let out a low breath. They'd be right. Summers turned to face him. "That's the problem." Creon tilted his head slightly. "They weren't supposed to be our enemies," she continued, her voice measured. "We didn't take their worlds. We didn't dismantle their fleets. We gave them every opportunity to build something together, and they chose to keep us as an afterthought until they had no other option." Creon nodded. "And now?" Summers looked back at the galactic projection, the new order forming before their eyes. "They'll fall in line, and they would, not because they feared Earth, but because they could no longer function without it." Across Tarsus Prime, the Confederation's media broadcasts shifted their narratives. Some spoke of a necessary restructuring. Others spun tales of humanity's patience finally breaking after years of dismissal. but in the households of 1,000 different species, in the quiet moments where officials and diplomats and traders whispered to one another in dim-lit rooms, the stories being told were different. They spoke of how humanity had played the long game, how they had held back, knowing the day would come when their silence would be mistaken for compliance. They spoke of how the Deathworlders had never been weak, and how the galaxy had only just begun to understand what that meant. Years passed. Across the Confederation, human-led initiatives flourished. Former rivals treated Earth's delegates with open deference. Trade routes flowed more efficiently than ever, because now they were no longer dictated by fragmented policies. Military discussions no longer happened without Terran oversight. The Confederation still existed, but it was no longer the same. On Belarus Prime, an education center filled with young alien students sat in rapt attention as a guest speaker entered their hall. Kate Summers, now holding a command title within the Joint Security Council, adjusted her posture before facing the eager students. The instructor gestured toward her. "Children, today you meet one of the architects of the New Order. You've all studied the history of the event known as the Deathworlder Revelation. Now you have the opportunity to hear from someone who witnessed it firsthand." A young student raised their hand, eyes wide with curiosity. "Is it true that humans never revealed their full strength until that day?" Summers smiled slightly. "We revealed enough." Another child, more hesitant, finally worked up the courage to ask, "Why did humans wait?" Her expression turned thoughtful. "Because power isn't about showing your hand. It's about knowing when to play your cards." The students absorbed the words, some whispering among themselves. Finally, one of them asked the question that many before had asked in different words. "Is it true that the Confederation was lucky?" Summers met the student's gaze. A pause. Then she answered, "They learned the lesson before it was too late." The instructor stepped forward, gesturing toward the overhead displays. "Class, as we conclude today's session, I leave you with this reminder. Every civilization in the galaxy now tells stories of the Deathworlders." Her voice carried with it the weight of history. "And the day they decided to stop being nice,